Can you actually stay sovereign in 2026? It isn't philosophical anymore, it is operational.
You could be debanked unceremoniously at a moment's notice. Having this power in the hands of just giant corporations and governments, that could be a very bad thing. Very bad. Things just like the internet, just like blockchain, where we could be entering a new golden age, or we could be entering a dystopia. Money that can't be confiscated, censored, or surveilled. Opting out is our nuclear option.
Can an average person actually opt out of this? And if they cannot, what does that mean for the movement that promised they could? So here's the question people in this space are afraid to answer honestly. Can you actually stay sovereign in 2026? Not theoretically, not in the white paper, not in a tweet thread, in your actual life, with your actual money, using actual tools that exist right now. So this is not a question. It isn't philosophical anymore. It is operational. My guest here, he has been living without a bank balance since 2015, not experimenting, not testing, just living. And today we are going to find out what he has been doing for a decade is actually a blueprint for all of us, or whether it is for the people that are more educated than us. Can an average person actually opt out of this, or is it too good to be true? And if they cannot, what does that mean for the movement that promised they could? So welcome, Joel. Thanks for taking your time and being in the podcast. Excited to get this started.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. And to briefly answer that question, yes, I think it's possible. There are some challenges, maybe, but I think that for the average person today, things are moving very fast. It should be very doable to live sovereign.
Cool. Yeah, we are going to unwind this in more details. So before I start anything, I want to ask you on a personal level, how is your life going? From 2015, how is it going from how you started? What was the moment when you actually started this thing? And how is it going so far? If you tell about your journey in 10 years.
Yes, absolutely. So I sort of began this journey, maybe not intentionally, but I've always had an interest in sound money, in monetary systems that don't have central bank control. I grew up in Mexico, and there was a serious currency crisis in the early 90s, and that sort of shaped my mental model for what this could look like. The money could disappear. And so I've always been interested in that. When I found out about cryptocurrencies in about 2012, 2013, had an interest, but then when I started using them, it became very clear that this was something that could really work at scale. And especially in places like the US, there was no real legacy payment app infrastructure. Like there wasn't the Venmos and the PayPals of the world that you could easily peer-to-peer transact. And to be able to do that to people you just met without downloading something special, doing KYC, connecting banks, all that kind of stuff, showed me that this could be something that worked at scale. So then I just started anything I could do in crypto. I found a way to do, and finally found myself that that's the only thing I really wanted to do, was to kind of explore this world, to be paid in this money, and to kind of go all in. And so sort of when I decided to go all in, it was more of a thing of forcing myself to switch careers and start to join the space. And it sort of made me figure it out. And so it was, in a way, like the trying to use this as money was not necessarily too much of a conscious decision, like I'm doing this way, I'm going to do this way. But it was going all in was a conscious decision. I figured in order to actually know what I'm talking about, I need some real experience. And so I got the real experience. And then within a couple of weeks, I got a job writing for Cointelegraph, which is one of the major crypto publications. And they were paying all in crypto. And so that sort of started me off. And then they say the rest is history, but basically it's just been a straight line since then.
So how was the ecosystem back then, and how has it evolved? If you talk about 2026 rather.
Yeah, the ecosystem in the past was very basic. I remember it was what I would call more of like a survival level ecosystem where you could use cryptocurrency as money. It was almost exclusively Bitcoin, especially back in 2015. And there was a few tools. So for the most part, first of all, there were a few on-ramps and off-ramps where you could sell if you needed to. And then there was one, maybe two gift card providers that were very sort of clunky, but you could do that, buy in advance gift cards and then redeem them. And then there were a few prepaid crypto cards. I remember I had a Wirex card back in the day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Wirex is still in the game today. And then ShakePay had another one, which I don't believe they do anymore, but they pivoted their business model. But so there were a few key tools. So basically, my life consisted of I'd spend on some gift cards. I'd spend peer-to-peer with a few places. There was a lot of local businesses that accepted crypto near to me. And so I did a combination of all that, and then sometimes would use a card and just sort of to all together sort of make it work. But it was one of those things where if you didn't have a peer-to-peer group of people that were willing to use this, it was very difficult. And also, if one service, for example, that you relied on had an issue, that really affected a massive way of what you could do. Now, what is the big difference now is there are so many different services now where if any 2 to 3 disappear, you can still find a way to spend. And also, it's not a Bitcoin-only space. In fact, Bitcoin's kind of falling behind the rest of the space in terms of being useful as money. And then it's also just the number of you have to sell crypto or use a card or something like that. Those kinds of necessities are far smaller than they used to be. So before, you kind of had to be a little bit of an adventurer to do this. And now I kind of feel like spending crypto in your daily life for, let's say, half your purchases or whatever is a very, very easy decision in most of the world. Is if you know how to use crypto, know what a wallet is, know how to scan a QR code, all that kind of stuff, know how to connect a wallet. I think that anyone in a lot of the world could move a big part of their life to using crypto.
And how does Dash comes into your picture? Do you use Dash more often in your daily life?
Yes. So when I started using crypto in 2013, I exclusively used it starting in 2015. So from 2013 to about the end of 2016, that was pretty much all Bitcoin. And I did use other cryptos when they were around, but they were more fun things to play around with. It wasn't something necessarily real. So at the end of 2016, the Bitcoin's network's congestion started to become a real problem. And I think people remember that more in 2017, but it was a problem a year earlier. And it just became very difficult for me to still use this as money. Waiting an hour for a confirmation is very difficult if you're using this in real life. And if you to make small purchases and pay several dollars for a priority fee, just really eats into your bottom line very quickly. So I had to have a decision of, do I stay with Bitcoin or do I do something different? And so when I decided to do something different, actually the decision wasn't stay with Bitcoin or do something different. It's do something different or exit crypto entirely and ask for my bank account back. And I didn't want to do that. So the thought process was very simple, right? I just went to the market cap rankings and then just, when's the next one down? Ethereum. Okay, that's great, but it's not being used as money. It's kind of doing other things next. And I don't remember, was it XRP or something, again, not being used. And then Litecoin was at that point an abandoned project. Like the code base wasn't being developed on. It was the next year, but at that point it was abandoned. And then the next one up, Dash. And by the way, this was a year before Bitcoin Cash, for example, even existed. Okay. So I would say, can I use this? And so it had a lot of features I liked, such as low fees and instant transactions. I thought that was very good. And I would say about when I made the transition, I decided to just only use Dash. And the first year or so, maybe the first year, about half of the services or half of the kinds of things that I used before, there was a Dash version where they did accept Dash. I could pay with Dash there, which is very nice. And then some of the ones that didn't, almost everyone, with very few exceptions, had a Shapeshift plugin. And Shapeshift was the only instant swap exchange that really functioned back then. Now there's so many, Changely, Change Now, Swap, whatever. There's so many. But it was the one that worked, and a lot of businesses had a little plugin where if you just said pay with Shapeshift, send a transaction, it would auto-convert to Bitcoin. Yeah. And so with that, I managed to basically not change too much of my lifestyle. It just worked out. And very quickly, I would say, like within a year, things got a lot easier because that was 2017 was the run-up when Dash hit the top 3 in coin market cap, got to over $1,600 a coin, and there's nothing that's a bigger billboard than that. So a lot of places started accepting Dash directly. So since then, it's been getting consistently easier. Obviously, the first maybe 6 months or a year might have been slightly more challenging than Bitcoin to use it, but then ever since then, it's been easier. And almost without exception, every single year that's gotten after that, it's gotten easier. So, especially these last few years. And so it's one of those things where you see a lot with cryptocurrencies. Market cycles come and go. You have big pumps, you have big dumps. And what I've noticed is, at least in the Dash ecosystem, there's been a constant growth in the utility that I crave, right? And I think
Yeah.
that, long term, that's kind of what really matters.
Yeah. How long you have been in Dash, if I could ask you?
Depending on the month, I don't remember the exact month I started getting in. It was probably later in the year, but probably close to 10 years.
Okay.
Dash has been
Wow.
around for 12 years.
Wow.
And I remember it was funny because I posted a picture on X where someone said, that was showing me I just bought lunch at a cafe with Bitcoin and
Mhm.
was saying it's so great that I get to spend in a real merchant. And people were commenting after I shared it. And then they're like, well, why Bitcoin? Why don't they take Dash? And I said, well, that was November of 2013. That was before, like many months before the Dash blockchain even launched. So
Mhm.
I remember my first interaction with Dash was I was at a festival in the middle of 2014, and there was a vendor who was selling bacon pancakes, and
Wow.
the coins he accepted was Dark Coin, which is what Dash was called in the first few months of its existence. And I just remember
Yeah.
that, but I didn't pay attention until a couple years later.
Intriguing story, because nowadays we see so many grand events where there are hundreds of different vendors showing their capabilities. I wonder how it was back in 2014. Must be very raw, very intriguing. Yeah.
Yes, and if I were to be nostalgic a little bit, I mean, I like today a lot better because everything is easier, everything's
Yeah.
more professionalized. But the one thing we have lost a little bit is the spirit of peer to peer, where
Yeah.
back in the day there were a lot of, I think there was more small merchants that accepted crypto into just like their phone wallet. A lot of people are more likely to send to each other and do peer-to-peer transactions, and that's kind of, people aren't as excited about that anymore. They're
Yeah.
more just using established services.
Do you think it is because of all the hurdles that are being put by the governments, different type of taxation, different type of allegations being put on crypto, and especially on the privacy coins?
Yes, I think that's a part of it. I don't think that's the biggest part. If I were
Mhm.
to guess what the biggest part is, it's that people expected that that's what Bitcoin was for. Bitcoin moved to more of an institutional asset, and the community never moved on fully to one or a few other projects, and they
Yeah.
just got used to other things, and then they got distracted by things like DeFi, NFTs, whatever. That's part of it. There is a part with, especially in the US, there were some peer-to-peer trading platforms that were taken down, and some traders were arrested, and so I think a lot of people became less willing to do peer-to-peer payments. Although, if you notice, the privacy coin space, and I have to say that in the peer-to-peer level, Monero seems to be kind of it's not as big as Bitcoin bet was back in the day, but a lot of people in the Monero community, also probably because they have few ways of spending it, get very excited about peer-to-peer things. And I spoke at Monerotopia in Mexico City a couple months ago, and it was very much what was going on there. A lot of people were excited to spend peer-to-peer. So I think that in the privacy realm, I think that we do see a little bit of that resurgence.
Yeah, true. I was having a conversation with the founder of Verge as well, and I think he's also in this space for a very long time. I think back in 2014. So he described the same as yourself, as far as journey. It started small, and then they started to get the traction. Suddenly, when the boom came, suddenly there was so much attention on them, and after the Pornhub partnership that they had, there was suddenly so many cops and all those stuff happening at their home and all those stuff, so which made them scared. But yeah, end of the day, it's good to see privacy getting the space that they actually deserved. I think back in, I think it is very recent, right? In 2025, they actually got those pumps, all the tokens that they shot up by a large number. So which is good to see, because they were the real OGs in my opinion. They started when there was nothing at all in the
Yeah.
space. They started building. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. Yeah.
A fun story about the nothing there. New Hampshire, where I live, which is outside of Boston, is kind of ground zero for the crypto movement. And the back in 2010, some friends of mine were running a radio show called Free Talk Live, and they mentioned Bitcoin on the show. After Gavin Andreessen, who was Satoshi's heir, who Satoshi gave the commit keys to, went up in person to be on the show, and he paid for his lunch in Bitcoin at like something like 37 cents per Bitcoin, something very low. And
Yeah.
hearing about that on the show is how Roger Ver learned about Bitcoin first. And then
Oh,
he became known as Bitcoin Jesus because he was the very first angel investor in Bitcoin companies and startups. There just were no companies in Bitcoin. So that's kind of the area I come from. Obviously, the Bitcoin ATM was invented in New Hampshire. There's a whole bunch of other things. The
wow.
first strategic reserve bill was passed in New Hampshire a few months ago. And so, a very strong kind of, I've seen the entire spectrum of like no companies, no nothing, very peer to peer to all the way where
You're
now
sitting
it's
at the
like,
very root. You are sitting at the very
yeah.
root of Bitcoin, and where it all started. Great, great. We talked about Satoshi, so I have to ask you. I'm sure you must be following, what is happening on X. I think there is a brief news made by New York Times where they are actually
Hmm.
trying to predict who Satoshi is. Do you think it actually matters who Satoshi is, or do you think it will lose value? I saw some podcast or some video where the guy was saying that the day when we know who Satoshi is, it will start to collapse. Do you think it even matters, or how do you see it?
I think it largely doesn't matter. It
Mhm.
partially does, but mostly does not. The reason why Satoshi matters to begin with is because of his work and what that did to the world. And so I think that a lot of times people try to look into the identity of Satoshi as a way to give credence to a different work. So to explain what I mean, like for example, you have the two people who've been quoted as Satoshi are Adam Back, of course, was
Yeah,
recently with the New York Times story, but also Craig Wright of the
yeah,
Bitcoin SV world. And in both of those cases, being Satoshi gives credence to their ideas, but in both cases, their ideas are contrary to Satoshi's ideas. Now, Adam Back had a lot more actual connection with the project than Craig Wright probably. But for example, Craig Wright has a lot of contradictions of Satoshi's words. He wants to create censorship vectors in the protocol. He's very pro authority, I guess, and it's completely antithetical to everything Satoshi talked about. And then Adam Back is not really interested in a peer to peer electronic cash system. He runs a Bitcoin treasury company and a bank like infrastructure on top of Bitcoin that would not be necessary if Satoshi's scaling plans had been created. So both of these are kind of anti Satoshis in a way.
yeah,
And Satoshi is not valuable because someone said there was a prophecy of someone named Satoshi Nakamoto, and whatever he says, you have to listen to. The only reason he's valuable is because his ideas and his inventions were valuable. And if you
yeah,
go against Satoshi's ideas, and it doesn't have value. And this is one of those things where I think if Satoshi becomes revealed and Satoshi does some very questionable things,
yeah,
I don't think it really matters who Satoshi is at that point. Because if Satoshi does not matter. Satoshi's ideas mattered. And if Satoshi himself has different ideas than the successful ones in the past, then that doesn't matter to me. It's the free market of ideas. Whatever is created, whatever is wonderful, whatever works out is what works. And so in that way, I think that discovering Satoshi would never increase credibility of the system. I think it can only hurt credibility, like if you find out it was a
yeah,
CIA operative, for example. But also, at this point, now that we have nation states competing over a Bitcoin infrastructure and things like that, and strategic reserves and paying tolls for shipping lanes and Bitcoin, all this, it's too late. I think it's too late to destroy the Bitcoin and therefore all of crypto's credibility just through whoever might be the founder.
yeah. That makes sense because, yeah, I have a similar feeling because people might, start linking that particular person, but it will be short lived because obviously
Hmm.
Bitcoin is, what Bitcoin is, right? We cannot tarnish what Bitcoin has done over the years. So yeah, it makes sense. Okay, yeah. So moving on, I was actually, doing a little bit of research about you and about Dash, what you guys have been up to. I was actually reading one article written by you back in 2024 that is called "How to Live on Crypto Privately," right? Where you have mentioned a single line which really intrigued me, right? Which was privacy is not binary, right?
Hmm.
So can you give me more context about it? What actually is privacy for you, and why it is not binary?
Yes. Let me give an analogy first of safety. Safety
Yeah.
is also not binary. You aren't either safe or not. So, for example, in my own situation, I live in a very safe part of the world. I am not a large but not a small person either. I've been training martial arts my entire life. I have a lot of perfectly legal weaponry, but still a lot. And I'm not the easiest person in the world to rob or scam. And does that mean I'm safe? Well, against a lot of people, yes. But if, for example, a SWAT team would be able to take me down with no problem,
Yeah.
I've trained again because I train martial arts, I encounter people all the time who can absolutely make me feel like a child. They're just way better than me. And by the way, one of those is Roger Fair. He's a very talented martial artist, but people don't know. Not everyone knows that about him. But does that mean that anything I have is useless? No, because I protected myself against a lot of threats that are possible in the world. But for my own potential threats, I would say almost 100% of things that would
Mhm.
be a threat to me are not a threat to me. The same thing happens with privacy. Perfect privacy is almost impossible to achieve, especially if someone's looking for you, is a high state level actor. So a lot of people might get discouraged saying, oh, well, if the CIA can find out who I am, what's the point? But most people don't have the CIA coming after them, right? That's people like Edward Snowden might be one of those who would have to worry about that. But for the most people, there's so many levels of things, whether it's just the petty advertiser or just getting adverts and tracking links and things like that that are spamming you up or that are taking advantage of you, or that, for example, a tracking link on an airline booking website might charge more for people in certain countries.
Yeah.
And just that bit of knowledge can just hurt you. You get on to larger, like, what if someone is able to track your financial activity? If someone sees you, for example, I believe Venmo for a while had a default public setting where all transactions would just be published on their social feed. And for me, that's insane anyway. But
Wow.
if someone had that on, then someone might say, oh, you're buying some expensive things, and just find out where you live and rob you. And if that's not public, then
Yeah.
that's not a problem. It's so the sophistication of adversaries, the you need more and more privacy, the more sophistication the adversaries have. And so for an average person, I think if an average person lived with my basic privacy and security practices, and I also would consider myself an average person for the most part, they have nothing to really worry about. They're kind of protected. The other thing about privacy is not hiding things. Privacy is consent. It's selective disclosure of information. So, for example, if I do a post on X, the world sees it. If I
Yeah.
send a DM on X, I still want it to be seen. I just don't want the world to see it. I want one
Right.
person or a small group in particular to see it. And so I think that I have nothing to hide is kind of something that people say where you don't have anything to necessarily hide, but you do have something to selectively disclose, such as the interior of, like, I'm not ashamed of where I live or my house, but I don't want everyone to know that. I want some people to know it. And I think that especially in the world today, the modern technological consumerist society, we have gotten used to, unfortunately, giving up all of our information for every single purpose.
Yeah.
And I believe that the first basic step is just to reclaim the consent of it. Is, can I have your one email address? No. Maybe you get none, or maybe you get one that is on the fly generated one that feeds back an alias that only you can get. Can I get your phone number? Well, no. And can I get you, etc.? Just no. Can I track your actual location down to your house? Because that's the thing with your IP address, it goes right to your house. And so if
Yeah.
someone can check your IP address, they know where you live. And that's a very, anyone who wants to do anything violent against you, that's probably the first piece of information they'd want to know is where do you live? Then anything can happen after that, especially if you can start seeing IP pings from that address with timing correlation. You can find out where someone would be home or not be home and then do whatever. And that's not information that I would trust anyone with.
Yeah, you made a couple of fair points. Privacy doesn't have to be binary, as you already mentioned. It could be something that can be tracked, something that is, you want to keep it personal, not because you are doing something wrong. It's just that you need to have consent. That makes sense. True. So yeah, let's talk about decentralization. I think you already mentioned that there is a major flaw in the whole decentralization space, that everything has to be transparent, everything has to be on chain, right? So yeah, decentralization also brought an idea, or a promise rather, that you will actually gain freedom and gain the sovereignty, right? Freedom from the banks, freedom from big players that are tracking all the details about you, right? So that was the promise that was made to everyone that got involved in crypto, right? But once you have started that journey now in 2026, do you think that promise is getting farther from us, instead of getting closer to us? Let me just give you a context about it, because there was certainly a lot of projects that started with that promise. Let's say, talk about Farcaster, right? You talk about Lens Protocol, talk about friend.tech. There were numerous projects that were launched with that promise, that you will be getting freedom from that, this, and all the stuff that they promised. But they, even after raising tons of money, right, they were unable to sustain. So do you think we are actually getting farther from that promise just because they cannot sustain by itself?
I would think that we're getting much closer to the promise, just not as a percentage of the space. It's maybe not nearly as big because before you had a very small, like you had Bitcoin at $130, for example,
Yeah.
and that was it. That was everything in the space, and only companies, as I mentioned, that like Roger Ver financed were even in the space, and that it was all very aligned, but that was it. Now, if you want to say the sovereign space, if you want to say the space that matters, that's about these values that we like, that space is so much bigger than ever before. But around it, the technology that space is part of is so much bigger now, and so now as a percentage of that space, it's so much smaller. So, for example, if you go to like a crypto conference, and again, I've been going to these for a very long time, the early Bitcoin conferences were very much like 80% about sovereignty, maybe something like that, like 80, 90, very high. Now the average Bitcoin conference is like 2% or something. It's very, or consensus or one of these things. It's very corporate. But then you have a cypherpunk conference like a Monerotopia, the Common Sense conference. I'm hosting my own Dash conference in Amsterdam in September. These kinds of conferences are, again, 90, 100% close to that sovereign, and they are bigger than the old Bitcoin conferences were. So if you want to talk about raw numbers of people in the space, of course, as a percentage, it's lower, but it is still growing. And the thing is, there's a lot of sovereignty is hard to really build in, right? This is a difficult problem that we're all trying to solve. We're basically trying to take the entire way the whole world has worked for all of human history and make it permissionless and decentralized. Almost create self-running sort of public goods, which didn't really exist before, right? We had natural resources like electricity and fire and wind and all the elements, but we didn't have these things. We didn't build anything that was just sovereign and working. Everything we built was owned or controlled by someone, and we're trying something very challenging. Of course, it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of money that's thrown towards those ideas, but that goes to maybe less good ones. And I think that we're at the point where I think that this probably was the last market cycle where money got thrown at everything. I think it'll be very hard to get money in the future. And we're already seeing that with some layoffs in the crypto space, or just the sponsorships at events. Like, for example, a good parallel, by the way, is a friend of mine, of course, runs the Common Sense crypto conference. It was called ETHDAM before, it was the Ethereum conference in Amsterdam. And before, it used to be you get some Ethereum protocol or something like that to just give a large sponsorship. And what was the ROI of that sponsorship? Who knows? But it was a good, networking tool. Everything worked. And then now just we have a lot of money to just throw on a sponsorship. That's not the thing anymore. And on the other hand, some of my other friends at Edge Wallet, which is a privacy-focused multi-coin wallet, I've noticed that they've been stepping up their sponsorships on just about everything, of KOLs, of meetups, of things like that, podcasts, whatever. And because they have actual users for some more sovereign purposes. So there is money out there. And same thing goes to Bitrefill, which is, again, one of my favorite companies. I've known the CEO for a long time. They're kind of the easiest way for the longest time for the average person to be able to spend crypto in real life across the world. And they have kept on growing and growing and growing, where now when I see KOLs all over the place with very large followings that are promoting their products, I see integrations into high profile things. They're growing. They have money. I think that there is going to be money in the space, but it's going to be deserved. I think there was a lot of undeserved money, that we had a sponsorship where we had sponsorship type things of like KOLs or whatever, which are sort of akin to like a mega corporation like a Visa or MasterCard just paying for naming rights on a stadium or something like that. Yeah. But we have companies that are less than 1% the size doing those same kinds of spends of just a naming right or something. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that that's going to be over permanently. To kind of end on the Farcaster thing, I have been, as I've mentioned, using cryptocurrencies for 13 years now, including a lot of very technical things. I have helped do QA testing for many wallets. I've been using decentralized or otherwise alternative social media networks, including built on several blockchains, for many years. All that being said, I've never successfully started using Farcaster. I've tried to sign up. I can't figure out how to make it work. Every place that tries to make it work says, oh, well, they'll send you an email or something. The email never comes, whatever. The point is, it's not a good product. I think the promise behind it was what got all the money in. But then we can't keep making products that don't work for anyone. We can't keep making bad user experience. We can't keep doing this and just expect because you put a crypto label on it, people will use it. People would not use something like that if it was like a mainstream regular social media platform, for example.
Yeah, I've been working, as I said, I've been in this industry for the last 7-8 years as well, working with a lot of different projects and seeing how they unfold. The same issue I've been seeing for a very long time as well is people try to put everything crypto. Right. It doesn't have to be so complicated, in my opinion, as well. If you have utility, you might, need decentralization or you might need crypto, but it doesn't make sense if you put everything, in crypto and showcase it as a project, which is what we usually are seeing. In the case of Farcaster as well, it promised us privacy and all those stuff. It stayed here, raised a lot of money, as you already know, but again, it failed to gather or capture the user's attention for that long, right? Which was mainly the reason for their downfall as well. So do you think we are overcomplicating things somehow, which doesn't have to be in this way?
In a lot of ways, yes. I think in a lot of ways, no. But basically, I think that what we are overcomplicating is what this is and why it matters. What this is, whatever this is, it started, of course, as money, purely money, and then it turned into data and applications, financial systems, everything. It's a universal, censorship-resistant way of doing these things. That's literally what it is. Decentralize all the things. That's the goal. And so if you want to do NFTs for artwork, what is it? It's a way of disintermediating the art world, for example, or tokenize whatever. And so make it do the things that we're already doing, but in a sovereign way. And same thing with money and payments and financial systems and real world assets and everything. It's just decentralize it and make it open to everyone. That's kind of the point. That's the simplicity in it. The complexity in it is, I think at some point, we have to realize that we created something very new. Where I remember, unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember a time before the internet, I remember using computers before there was really a widespread internet, and I remember sending physical letters to correspond with people and then sending emails, and then I've sort of seen the whole thing. And the internet is not just a modernization of communication, it's also a new thing. There's a lot of things that would never exist, like, for example, streamers. Just people who stream, whether they're playing a game when they stream or just stream. Why would that exist? No, it's a completely new thing, not suitable for like television. It's not like what you could call a podcast interview like this, like a different version of television, for example.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that just aren't like that are completely different. And so we can't expect, when you create something radically new, you can expect things to pop up that did not exist before, novel things. And with crypto, there are a lot of novel things that have popped up, such as decentralized autonomous organizations, where it's a group, it's an organization, but it's not a single company or nonprofit or something where you can just sort of say, these are the people. You approach it with like the board of directors and all that. It's very like amorphous. And like one example of this, for example, is, so I've been working full time with Dash DAO for about 2.5 years. And about a few months ago, one of my colleagues joined, Dasha, who works in the kind of the Eastern theater, kind of the Southeast Asia and all that area. And she's, I wouldn't say an employee, more of like a colleague, but she got hired with no knowledge from me or anyone else I work with necessarily. She submitted a DAO proposal, the DAO voted for it, and now she's part of the DAO. And that inability to have oversight I think is a very beautiful thing, but it's also just a different thing. Like people don't, like when people say, oh, I got a new coworker, employee, or employer, and you just did not even know about it because it's decentralized. It's a very new, different thing.
Yeah.
Some other things that are very, very different are like using competing tokens and currencies. That's not really been a thing in the old world. There's just a lot of, for example, NFTs are a big thing that I think are going to have a big comeback at some point, but they were kind of too limitless in potential. And so people did the one thing that was easy to do, which is put an image on it and sell it. But there's so much you could do with it. And at some point, you won't be able to say, this is just like this, but new. It's going to be a different thing. It's not a business. It's not a natural resource. It's not a company. It's something else. And so that does complicate things. I think that, I do think that the real complications are not the what, but the how, right? Where I think that a lot of people get distracted by the what and don't focus on the how, where the how being, how do we scale this to billions of users around the world? How do we keep the user experience good enough? How do we make sure that the infrastructure is actually censorship resistant and you can't just take down a few data centers or hold a couple of foundation members hostage and affect this whole network? How do you create privacy at scale that doesn't harm everything? How do you make all this resistant to future quantum threats? Have do you make sure to keep very valuable financial monetary code bases, make sure that they are resistant to the latest AI models, which have been finding bugs in 20-year-old software? And so how do you navigate all this? Like, what do you do? I think that's a very difficult problem that we'll never fully solve, that we're just working on constantly. But I really, that's one of those reasons why I believe in the simplicity of our mission, is if we get our mission simple and focused, then we can actually have the bandwidth to spend on solving the difficult problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. You briefly mentioned about the DAOs, right? You have been part of it for the last 2 years. I was reading about Dash, and I think Dash's treasury DAO has been running for last 10 years, if I'm not wrong. How does that work? Because I haven't seen DAO running for so long and being so consistent about it.
Yeah, so Dash is the oldest DAO in existence. There might have been some contention that BitShares or something was earlier, but it's not really functioning currently. I think that there's two things that make Dash's DAO kind of stand out as far as how it's been functioning for so long. One thing is, I would say, is its simplicity. A lot of DAOs might be overcomplicated with too many things, and a lot of the basic structure is Dash masternodes, Dash validators, vote on proposals every month, and every month 20% of the block reward of the new coins that are created are available to be spent. and whichever proposal gets the most votes gets funded as long as there's funding, and then that's it. And for governance proposals, there's no explicit function for governance. What people do is they put in a proposal for 1-, which is the anti-spam fee. So they just ask for a refund, which anyone looking at that knows that the reason they're putting in the proposal is not to ask for money, it's to ask a question. And then the question is out there, and that's it. And because it's simple, I think that it's difficult to hijack or have issues with it. The other thing that I think it's strangely unique in Dash today, where there's a few others, such as, Zcash is not a DAO yet, but they're moving in the direction, and Decred has something similar. But basically, where funding for this comes regularly every month. I think that what we have in a lot of cases is two categories of crypto projects, right? We have the massive VC funded, whatever, let's not to pick on anyone, but like the Avalanche, like at Ava Labs, and they had a massive war chest of just untold amounts of money. And then you have, let's say, the Litecoins of the world, where Litecoin is also doing, I would say, very well in a lot of ways, but it does not have a lot of capital to fund development. There's like one developer as far as I know. And then the founder, when he comes back, he does help fund things here and there. But again, I work with the Litecoin Foundation on some conference things, and they're very kind of limited in their resources. And so most of the space either has no money or too much money, and too much money then turns into no money over time. And I think that the limitation with Dash has been we haven't had a lot of money to be able to spend on massive partnerships, integrations. For example, I was talking with a market maker the other day, and they're talking about, well, we typically do like a liquidity loan where you'd give say $500,000 worth of tokens for a period of time, and then we give it back. And I'm like, well, there's no one at Dash who has that. If funding comes out consistently. But on the other hand, the advantage of that is that you learn to be disciplined and you learn to be cost effective because you're restricted to your monthly budget. And the monthly budget grows and contracts with the price of Dash. So you can't get too comfortable. You have to be wherever you're at. But also, it's always there. It's just constantly coming out and is not going away. And so because of that, I think that there's no richness and there's no poverty. There's just middle class all the way through. And so I think that that's what's kept it consistent. There are some crypto researchers, such as Justin Bonds of Cyper Capital, who one of the things he particularly likes Dash for is the consistency of the funding, the way it just happens like that. And a lot of modern DAOs tend to have a big pot of money, and they spend it and maybe not do it very well. So, yeah.
So Dash is basically our father, right? So they have enough money, but they spend judicially. They don't spend recklessly. And different coins are like us. We have money and we spend it over, things that we don't even need. And then we
Yes.
go back to our father and ask for money, and there is no money
It's
left.
like winning the lottery versus having a job.
Yeah,
You might have the same lifetime earning
yeah,
of, let's just say someone makes 100,000 a year and they work for 10 years versus they get $1 million today. A lot of times the person with the 100,000 a year will probably have a much better life at the end of the 10 years than the person with $1 million. And so I think it's something similar.
yeah. That's a great analogy. It makes sense as well. That it now makes sense that you guys have been so consistent over the time and still running and still growing. That makes sense. Cool. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about what everybody is talking about, AI. In my opinion, there is two perspectives. Either we can use AI to have the best of the surveillance that we can ever have, or we can use the AI like individuals are using to get out of this nexus and be sovereign as per se. So how do you see things unfolding? Do you think we will go this way or that way? How do you think things are going to unfold?
I think it's too early to tell for sure how things will unfold. I'm waiting to see a couple things.
Mhm.
I think what I would really think about AI is, first of all, it's going to change. It already has changed everything. And any big technological innovation, like let's say the big ones of my lifetime are first the internet and then crypto and blockchain and then now AI. Those are all like generational transformative technologies. What I think it will end up doing in some way is I think that there will always be a gulf between I guess, the richest and the most powerful in the world and the regular people. And I think that that gulf will get bigger, which I don't think is a good thing necessarily. But on the other hand, I think that the quality of life or the abilities of the average person will go far up. So
Okay.
I think that it's going to be a lot better for most people. And I've sort of experienced that in obviously my own life, but also, for example, in the Dash DAO, I use a lot of AI tools for a lot of different things. And despite having a relatively small budget, I'm able to achieve a lot of good things. And then the Dash developers were some of the earliest ones to lean heavily into AI to assist in coding in a way where now major parts of the protocol have a lot that's built using AI tools thanks to some very smart senior developers who understand the code base extremely well and are not going to just try to vibe code a critical feature. Like, they understand what they're looking at. And I think that it's allowed Dash to create innovations that are past where its budget might be right now. So the challenge with AI is just the challenge with everything, is decentralization, permissionlessness, where you have massive numbers of people using personal AIs through services like ChatGPT, for example, that then censor key things or collect all their data, and create dependencies on companies. And so I think that having this power in the hands of just giant corporations and governments and things like that is going to create a bigger gulf between the weak and the powerful, and that could be a very bad thing, very bad, and hard to overcome. I think that open source local models are kind of the way, and the more we can push this forward, the more innovations we can sort of push into localized control, I think the better. And so it depends on how AI adoption happens. Like, if people are running a local model on their own machine, or some sort of, even if they're not using a local model, if all their data is owned by themselves or is otherwise on a decentralized censorship resistant network, I think that this could be one of the biggest, I guess, equalizers in the history of the human race. And on the other hand, if the powerful have a monopoly on this is where things get very, very bad. So it's one of those things, just like the internet, just like blockchain, where we could be entering a new golden age, or we could be entering a dystopia, and we have to be very careful on selecting which path we use.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, but speaking to your point, you mentioned there could be a amalgamation of decentralization and AI, right? But if I'm not wrong, I haven't seen a huge burst with AI and decentralization as of now. All the updates, all the progress that is being made, it is basically layered on top of centralized databases that these guys have. So do you think decentralization, or blockchain rather, is getting lagging behind this race, or do you think blockchain is for the niche and AI is more of a product for the mass? What is your take on that?
I think that everything is a mass product at the end of the day. And it's for everyone, not mass product, but also for elites as well. The thing with cryptocurrency and blockchain is the end user products have not been fleshed out very well. Probably the best end user products are digital cash products. And that is such a massive change in lifestyle, as we talked about earlier, that I think that it's going to be mass adopted, but it's going to take some challenges. Whereas AI is a little bit easier for the average person to just use AI powered tools, use an AI powered chatbot for support questions on a site, whatever it is. I think at the end of the day, these things sort of have to merge and not necessarily become indistinguishable, because of course they're different things. But I do think that the biggest challenge is a lot of local sovereign ways of using AI is just not feasible, because the average person does not have a powerful enough computer to run these models, does not know how to manage the data, does not know how to manage uptime, etc. And at the same time, they don't want to be trusting a mega corporation. So I think that as we have AI projects that basically run infrastructure and run models in a kind of a cloud way, but are not run by a single company that are run in a decentralized way where anyone can potentially participate and pay for them with anonymously and keep privacy of their data, etc. I think that that's the killer app. I haven't done sufficient research to comment too much on that. I think that Venice is a project run by my friend Eric Voorhees, and I think that they're doing a lot of that. At least that's what I've been told. A lot of better things like that. And hopefully it won't be the last. Hopefully we have a lot more of those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think, big players, they will be pivoting to blockchain, or do you think it will take away their powers that they have been building for so long? Or does it even matter?
It's hard to tell. I think that everyone uses the tool that's the most effective for them. And so far, big players have not found a use for blockchain. They have in some cases, like for example, I know that Canton is getting a lot of attention these days for doing a private financial network for institutions, but also that's kind of permissioned and invite only. It's not really a decentralized system at all. But I think that the real thing is what everyone benefits from is the network effects of an open universal layer of some kind. Everyone benefits from that. That's from the smallest user to the largest corporation. They all benefit from that element. The problem is the smallest user benefits from decentralization and censorship resistance, whereas the large players benefit from something that they control. And so I think that what we will see is the larger players will try to use their own permissioned versions of these things as long as they can. And eventually the customer, who's always right, goes for whatever works for them. And if we get a workable enough fully decentralized public chains and get them into the hands of masses, I think that will end up creating the network effects so that the large corporations and powerful entities on their own censored private networks, they will find out that they're missing out on a whole lot of capital and network effects and things like that. And so then they will be forced grudgingly to sort of use this. Of course, the best example of all this, I would say, is Bitcoin, where Bitcoin, as I'm personally disappointed in for not fulfilling the digital cash promise, it is still, for an institutional level player, it's their version of a peer-to-peer digital cash where it will work for large transfers and the fees are going to be very low for that. And you see, for example, in the most recent news of the last couple of days, at least from when we recording this, the Iranian government asking for payments in cryptocurrency, or Bitcoin specifically, I believe, for vessels trying to travel through the Strait of Hormuz. So clearly it's become useful to large players. Now, these same large players, a lot of these financial institutions, the Michael Saylors of the world, whatever it is, would prefer to have something that's controllable, that they can control themselves. But that's not the reality of things. The reality is that these assets, at least one in particular, has grown to a size where it's undeniable and you need to just use it to have a part in it. And so I think that institutions, ETFs, all those kind of did not want to participate in decentralized tech at all, but they had to because it became where all the action's at. The same will be for just about everything. If you can build a large enough thing that's permissionless, then you will get all the large permissioned entities settling for a part of control, even if rather than not losing it entirely.
Yeah, you mentioned about big players and the ETFs and the governments getting involved in this. That is why I wanted to talk about the CBDCs as well. As for today, when I was checking some details about CBDCs, I found out that I think more than 90% of the countries, they are actually venturing into CBDCs. So how do you see, things panning out once all the digital currencies have been processed out? How do you see how it looks like for, let's say, decentralization or the crypto rather?
Yeah, CBDCs are an interesting subject because I kind of feel like CBDCs remind me a lot of the quantum threat, where it's something that's very real and catastrophic maybe, but is sort of very theoretical at the same time and very sort of overhyped in some ways. Where I think that, for example, there have been CBDC pilots all over the world and they just have not gone well at all.
Yeah.
Like I can't think of a single successful one. So I'm not sure if this is something that will become ever successful. But also in terms of like CBDC, it's more of a concept than like a literal thing. So for example, if you break down the terminology, it's a central bank digital currency. And what people don't like about that is surveillance and censorship. Those are the negative elements. Now, if you think about, not to specifically, call out anyone in particular, but if you consider USDC by Circle, right? The currency is issued by a central bank, meaning USDC is backed by the US dollar or treasuries or dollar equivalents, which is from a central bank. The value of USDC is pegged to the central bank currency of the US, and it's a digital currency. It's a central bank issued digital currency, although the tokenization is issued by a company, but it's still the central bank. And it is also on a fully public blockchains and have built-in censorship capabilities. So you could argue that something like USDC is already a CBDC, or it works for a lot of the same purposes. And an official CBDC would probably be just the same thing, but a little bit more formalized, a little bit more efficient. And so I think that a lot of people are very afraid of CBDCs when we're kind of already there. You could argue a lot of people's bank accounts are already CBDCs because central bank currency, they transact digitally, they have data sharing agreements with all the card providers and everything. And you could be debanked unceremoniously at a moment's notice. We're already kind of there and kind of not there. And so I think that CBDCs, I don't think there's a looming CBDC threat necessarily. I think we're kind of there today in practice. And I also think that it really depends on the adoption of sovereign currencies, right? As far as are people using, and it turns out that privacy coins are the ones that tend to be the vehicle for sovereign currencies. Of course, you can have that. I'd argue it's hard to have one without privacy, but basically, are people using sovereign digital assets instead of central bank pegged ones? And can they do that at a greater scale? And that's the real fight. That's where we can really see how things are going. And obviously, stablecoin volume is taking off all over the world. It's doing far more than other cryptocurrencies. I would say, what is the TVL, the market capitalization, the volume, the users, etc., of sovereign currencies versus all fiat currencies, including stablecoins? And that's the progress bar I would like to keep track of.
Yeah, that's something that we have to ponder on. Moving on, when all the so-called CBDCs, they will be launched, and how people like you and I, they are going to tackle it. What would you suggest a person like me, like a layman, if he has to gain sovereignty? Let's say, what is the least hindered step he can take in his life to achieve that?
Yeah, I would say the quickest, the best thing is just get used to sovereign money. So I would download a non-custodial wallet of some kind that works very well. I'd acquire some cryptocurrency and then make sure you practice using it, sending it around just between friends, etc. And then pick one expense or one bill, something like that you need to pay on a consistent basis, and find a way of doing it using cryptocurrency, and then make that a repeated step. And it's just like a fun thing you do. And then expand that as you can. And one thing, it is, the financial system works for a lot of people in the world temporarily. And unfortunately, if you get a disruption or debanked or whatever, everything grinds to a halt. And so the one thing that, even though part of my life is more challenging, the one part that's not more challenging is I always have money that will work everywhere in the world for any purpose. If my app decides to malfunction, I can put my recovery phrase into a different app, and if this service goes down, I can just use a different one. And so, for example, if let's just say I use crypto card or something like that. If you had a bank account and your card gets declined, whatever money is associated with that is essentially just not usable. Whereas if I load a card and it doesn't work, I can just load a different one and that one works. And so just being able to have that optionality, I think, is massive. So just getting used to using cryptocurrency as money, and especially in small and consistent ways, will teach, of course, a lot. And the next thing is just to look into some basic privacy tools that don't disrupt your life, such as use the Brave browser instead of Chrome, use Signal for encrypted messages, use a VPN. I'm a big fan of NIM VPN because it works on a decentralized mixed net that's not just one company that's surveilling you and hoping they help you. And so just a few of these things you switch on, and then life just works the same as it did before, but you have extra privacy and sovereignty.
So do you think it's it's an education issue? You really have to dug in deeper in the rabbit hole of sovereignty to actually gain it. Do you think that is the major hindrance that is causing us, all the data that we are sharing on a daily basis with all those people, just because it is too hard to gain that level of sovereignty?
I think an education issue is part of it. It doesn't need to be an education issue because I think that these everyone has a full life of some kind. Everyone has a full suite of financial products of some kind, whether it's a bank, they have their payment app, they have whatever, maybe cash in their pocket for some countries at least. They also have like an email address, they have an internet provider, they have a browser, they have all these things. And I think that it can be just as easy to use a sovereign version of all of those things. The challenge is some of these things are happening very quickly. So, for example, NIM VPN probably wasn't super viable as of a year ago, but maybe now it's much better. Some things like that. And then there just isn't a package that keeps all these together. And so, for example, in a privacy educator, there's a friend of mine, Naomi Brockwell, has a great video on, or a series of videos, I guess, on how to completely move your life to a private one. And, when I decided to sort of do all this all at once, and I found out that there's some like bumps along the way as far as like which step do you take first? Do you get a private email before you get a private phone number, a VoIP number, or whatever, and which one goes first? And then one of them, for example, for a lot of these phone numbers, etc., there's a service called MySudo that was recommended, but it doesn't work with Graphene OS, which is the privacy-focused operating system for some Android devices. And so there's some like inconsistencies in all that. It doesn't come as a clean package. So mostly, I would say the lack of education is only a problem because everything is still kind of scattered around and not it's still a little bit new. So right now, yes, you do need more education in order to embark on a more sovereign life. But I think that in the future, once we have like a very simple sovereign stack, as they would call it, then I think you can just go to one guide. And I kind of try to do that a little bit with my How to Live on Crypto guide. But even then, some of it's like, well, you sign up for a few different services, you do this, you do that, and do some research here. And it just seems to be it's a little disjointed, but doable. And one of those things that's one of those reasons why I decided to focus heavily on Dash professionally, is because I think that nothing else is close enough to being a universally usable money. And I think Dash is the closest of all the sovereign ones. And I want to start with one path you can just stick to. Because currently, I think we're kind of at that path where if you want to live completely on crypto, you can pretty much just do Dash at this point. And I would say that's like in a 90%. Now, I want to get it to 100% where people don't have to think about it. I can just say, use this currency, download this wallet, do these services, and that just works. And if people want to use other cryptocurrencies, they can. But right now, the education issue is kind of a result of having to sort of juggle a few different services and protocols.
Yeah, that makes sense because you mentioned it right. Because there is a certain step that you have to take towards gaining that sovereignty, right? Because by default you have been raised in this ecosystem where you have to do this, have a bank account, have a phone, Android phone, link your accounts to all the stuff, share your phone numbers and all those stuff. So it is here by default. So you have to take an extra step to get out of this nexus, which is being built by the governments and all those stuff. So yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, that leads to my my initial question. Let's say we are in 2030, considering the CBDCs that are coming along, considering the AI effect that is coming along with heavy surveillance that can be placed in, right? Do you think we can actually achieve the 100% sovereignty, let's say in 2030? Do you think decentralization can catch up with it, or do you think we will be, losing it to these guys?
I think the way things are going to work, I do think we can have majority sovereignty, right? I think the way things work, this is more of like a large conceptual thing. On a technical level, absolutely, we can have full sovereignty. On practical level, there will always be people who are large and powerful, and even on decentralized systems, will sort of corner certain parts of the network and the ecosystem where it becomes very difficult for the average person to avoid some influence. But on a larger level, if you think about, there's always an interplay between the rulers and the ruled, and there have been as long as there have been human civilizations under every form of dictatorship to democracy, where I wouldn't say that there's necessarily is consent of the governed, but there is a level of I guess brutality you can't go past without dealing with an uprising in some cases. Yeah. And I think that with sovereignty, there's always a negotiation between the rulers and the ruled as far as what deal do we get out of this. And I think that for the longest time, we've had too strong of a negotiating hand from the ruling class. And now with decentralized systems, we have so much more of a powerful negotiating group. So like, for example, one of these basic concepts is like, for example, the concept of taxation, where everyone in most of the world at least has no choice but to pay a large percentage of their earnings in taxes, and it goes to all kinds of awful things, and that's just the way it is, and you can't do anything about it. With cryptocurrency, especially the private ones, we have an ability to, for a lot, just on a theoretical level, completely avoid that, to completely have money that can't be confiscated, censored, or surveilled. And on a practical sense, though, people will find out about you, probably will go to prison if you try that 100%. But so now that we have this, we can opt out, even though there's cost to opting out. Now what happens is no one wants to live in a constant state of rebellion, of living underground, of conflict. Everyone wants a peaceful, normal life. And at some point, I think that there will be a renegotiation of how this works out, where I think that by having the ability of maximum sovereignty, to use like the tax example, I think that people, I wouldn't say everyone, but the majority of the planet would be happy to pay a reasonable tax rate if they got certain things in exchange for that, and that they're not getting right now. They're paying unreasonable rates for not a good thing. And I think that at some point, both sides will sort of come up to a ceasefire, right? An agreement of these people could be completely sovereign, but then they would have to hide, and maybe some would go to prison, and that's not good. And then these people could try to enforce all of their current laws and current edicts or whatever, and we'll see how that works. Or they both could just not fight and just agree, this is a reasonable thing. We can have something that everyone is sort of content with. And so maybe that's a bit of a cynical take for like the radical anarchist part of the world, where,
yeah.
But it's a realistic take, and I think that it's a very optimistic, realistic take, where we would love to live in a world where the system, it treats us a lot better, and we have more options. And I think we find that in the sort of free market, where everyone is unhappy with whatever company they're using, but they have choices. So, for example, Claude, of course, the coding, Anthropic's, prime models really reached mass usage, and then over the last couple of weeks have significantly throttled usage. The models have gotten not nearly as intelligent, at least the ones not that are released. And they also ended official support for OpenClaw and are releasing their own kind of proprietary softwares. And a lot of people are just switching to whether it's OpenAI's models or some other things like that. And so that's the kind of relationship that we're hopefully looking forward to in the future with governments and institutions around the world, is not necessarily that you don't use them, that they're not in your life, but that if things get too bad, there's an easy enough exit so that it does prevent things from getting too bad in the long term.
Yeah, that's intriguing. So you are basically telling that there should be options for people to choose from, right? Rather than being imposed on, having to do certain things, right?
Yes, and having an option to exit is all that's necessary. It's the nuclear option, as it were. And obviously, nuclear-armed nation-states have this option where they will never, hopefully, use nuclear weapons, but because they can, there's a limit to how much another country can do against them. Yeah. And opting out is our nuclear option, is our option where even if we never opt out, we always use these services. The fact that you could just cancel your plan tomorrow and go do something else and run a local model and you would be fine, and it's realistic, even if you'd rather do that, that threat, that implicit threat of I could exit, I think keeps things in check.
That makes sense. That makes sense because till the time you know that you don't have a monopoly, you will be in check. That makes sense. Yeah. Cool. I think it's a wrap from my end. We started with a question. Can we achieve sovereignty in 2026? And after 90 minutes of conversation, we can safely say that we have ways to find a way. You just have to dig deeper, pick your lane and start digging, and you will certainly find your way. So that is a wrap from my end. That is a wrap from our end, rather. And if you were able to, learn one thing from this on how you can change certain things from, staying dependent on things, do share it with someone who needs it. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.
Thanks very much.